Fear can live with us for years after an event occurs. Most would agree that it never completely leaves us, and it often molds us into someone else. Afraid, protective, anxious, tough, or paralyzed with fear. Everyone reacts differently to every situation they find themselves in. The people in these stories share the moment of fear that affected them for the rest of their life. Enjoy. This happened to my mother, and she has told me the story a few times over the years. This happened when she was in college. She's turning 65 this year, so I guess it happened about 45 years ago. She was born and raised in Tennessee and went to college there. A small college in eastern Tennessee that at the time was even smaller than it is now. The area has grown since then, but back then, it was a small town and the outlying areas were mostly farms. One weekend, her and her best friend, they were sorority sisters, were invited to a party out at another friend's parents' farm. Her best friend's boyfriend offered to drive. So off they went. My mom, her friend Eileen, and her boyfriend at the time, we'll call him Jack. This was before GPS and cell phones, so they got lost in the back country trying to find their friend's farm. As they turned down a dirty road, they were stopped after driving about a mile by a man standing in the middle of the road. He had no car that they could see, and was wearing what looked like a police officer's uniform. He approached the car and asked Jack to roll down the window, and proceeded to ask them what they were doing out there. Eileen in the passenger seat said they were looking for their friend's farm and must have taken a wrong turn. She then asked him if he knew where it was and if he could point them in the right direction. "Turn off the engine and get out of the car," was his response. My mother, sitting in the back seat, noticed that his uniform was somewhat dirty. She said that it was navy blue, so from far away you couldn't tell. But as he was right next to her window, she could see that it had dirty stains on the shirt, and the pants looked more like dark blue jeans instead of officer's pants. Jack asked the officer why they needed to get out of the car, and said that they were just lost, and if they were trespassing, he'd be happy to turn the car around and go back the way they came. "I don't need you to argue with me. I need you to turn off the engine, and you and the ladies need to get out of the car." My mother leaned forward into Jack's ear and told him not to turn the car off. Eileen then pleaded with the officer that they were just looking for directions and they weren't causing any trouble. The officer then leaned down more into the vehicle and told her to stop talking and looked at Jack again and told him to turn the car off. At this point, my mother said the tension was extremely high, and she knew that something was very wrong. My mom whispered to Jack, "Just go, just go." Jack became flustered and turned to look at my mother. That's when my mom said louder, "Jack, just go." At that point, the officer reached his arm into the vehicle and tried to grab the keys. Jack swatted his hand away, and my mother screamed, "Eileen!" At that moment, Eileen grabbed the stick shift and threw the car into gear. Jack pressed the gas and the car jolted forward and the officer was pushed away from the vehicle. Here's where it gets really freaky. My mother then turned around to look through the back window, and as they were driving away, she saw two other men behind a thick set of bushes with chains. They had metal chains in their hands and were hiding. They were still freaking out because they still had no idea where the road was going. Would it dead end? Would there be more men ahead? Everyone in the car was hysterical. Luckily for them, the dirt road met up with a paved road in a couple more miles. They went back to the campus and filed a report with the campus police, but nothing ever came of it. Their friends with the farm never heard anything else about the men. There were no other reports about the men. Nothing. My mother said she would have almost been relieved to hear they were escaped mental patients or criminals on the run. At least it would have been an answer. She said the most unsettling thing about it is that they just disappeared. To this day, she believes she would have disappeared too if they would have gotten out of the car. I was around 5 when one Sunday my dad received a call from friends of his, asking him to grab some beers and join them. When we got there were plenty of kids for me to play with. But when we walked into the house, there was a little girl my age on her hands and knees cleaning the floor, while 2 drunk women sat drinking at the table. The girl was my age, maybe a year older. My dad scolded them and got the girl off the floor and sent her to play with me. I forget her name, but I do remember playing with her for the rest of the day. As evening approached and the beer gone, my dad proceeded to gather me up to go home. But just like any kid meeting new friends, I cried to stay with my new friend. My dad had to promise me that we would return the next day to see her again. The following day I went to school, which was only a half day since I was in preschool, and I was so excited to see my new friend. When I arrived home off the school bus, my dad wasn't there to greet me, so I walked home by myself, feeling like a big girl. As I approached the back of the house, I noticed a cop car and ran inside, excited because it was different for me. My dad rushed me into my room and told me not to come out until he came for me. This felt like forever, but it may have just been moments until he came back to my room. He was ashen white, and his eyes were red-rimmed with tears. Not knowing what had happened, I asked him if we could go see my new friend now. That's when my dad proceeded to tell me that we won't be going there anymore, and that my friend wasn't there. As a child, I didn't understand what happened, but as time went on and people talked, I figured it out. After we left the little girl's house that night, her mother, one of the drinking women at the table, had tortured and drowned her daughter. It took a long time for all of the details to be revealed, but apparently, the little girl had told her mother she was being abused by a family member, and her mother wanted to cleanse her. So she boiled water on the stove, put her daughter in the tub, and poured water over her and scrubbed her with the brush she was previously washing the floors with when we had arrived. She then held her under the water. My dad told me later that all he could think about was how close he was to letting me stay there for the night, and how glad he was this one time that he said no to me. When I was 8 years old, we had an attempted break-in. My dad was a correctional officer at the local prison, so we always had an air of caution growing up. We suffered through the usual family things, family members of inmates stalking us, being bullied at school by kids because my dad wasn't a real cop, things like that. But when I was 8, something terrifying happened. We had a sleepover with friends. My sister and her friend were in the bedroom, while my brother, his friend, and I were in the living room sleeping on the couch. My sister and her friend came out of the bedroom, terrified. They woke us up and told us to go into my dad's room. We were confused and asking questions, of course. But my sister being the oldest, she was very demanding. Before we had the chance to get into the bedroom, the banging on the windows started, and the handle of the front door was turning. We lived in a small community where everyone knew everyone, but we still locked our door because of my dad's profession. We hurried into my dad's room, my sister practically carrying me because I was crying from fear. We told my dad what was happening. He jumped up, grabbed his gun and a curtain rod, and ran outside in his underwear and boots. They were gone by then, but we called the cops, and that's when I found out what had caused my sister to come and get us. It was winter, but her and her friend had the window cracked a bit to let the cool night air in. They were woken up by two older men asking them to come outside, that they had something for them. It was 3 a.m, and of course Casey and her friend were freaked out. They shut the window and came out to get us. The men didn't get what they wanted, so they started to pound on the windows and door trying to get in. Our dog was going crazy at the noise, which caused me to cry even harder. When the police arrived, they found 2 sets of footprints leading into the backyard where our other dog stayed. She must have bitten one of them because there was a piece of fabric in her mouth and she had blood on her teeth. I eventually calmed down that night, but I will never forget that incident. When I was a sophomore in high school, I had my first real boyfriend. He was a senior, and I felt pretty cool because he noticed me. Everything was going great, until I started receiving notes. Apparently, my boyfriend wasn't the only one who had noticed me. At first, it seemed harmless. Occasionally, I'd find typed notes left on my doorstep saying that I looked nice that day. I didn't think much of it at first, because I had a couple of girlfriends who would play jokes and leave little notes every once in a while. I didn't start to get nervous until the notes said things about how much this person cared for me and loved me like no one else ever would, or would ever make me happy like this person could, especially my new boyfriend. I started getting presents and flowers along with the notes. These would come several times a week. I got really uncomfortable about receiving gifts and the admiration of someone I didn't know. The stranger also started to say threatening things about my boyfriend and how much this person hated him. My boyfriend became very frustrated and angry with this stranger and worried about me, so he decided to find out who it was. One day, I got a necklace from my admirer, and my boyfriend came up with a plan to try and catch the guy. I would wear the necklace the next day at school, in the hopes that this person would notice and leave me another note that night, and my boyfriend would try to watch and see who it was. My boyfriend waited at my house late that night, hoping to get a glance of my admirer, but he never came. The next morning, there was a note at my door. It said that I looked great in the necklace and that he knew that my boyfriend was waiting at my house that night. I started to get really scared, but I didn't want this creep to control my life, so I brushed it off. My boyfriend, however, was determined to get to the bottom of it. He continued to stay over late at night, and he started parking a couple of blocks away so the stalker wouldn't recognize his car. It got really scary when he went home around 12:30 on a school night, and moments after, the phone rang. My mom answered, and then she started yelling into the phone. It was him, the stalker. He told my mom that he knew my boyfriend was there that night and that he had just left. He was watching my house late into the night. Now I was terrified. I had no idea who this person was, and he was constantly watching my every move. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. I didn't want to go back to school. We had to get the cops involved because my family and boyfriend were really concerned about my safety. The cops would patrol around my neighborhood all night and into the day. Yet somehow, my stalker would sneak past and continue to leave notes and gifts. One time, the cops had a suspect and they interrogated him, and they said he seemed really sketchy, but they couldn't pin anything on him at all. Over the next few months, things started to wind down. Fewer and fewer notes were showing up, and eventually stopped altogether. The following couple of years, I received a large bouquet of flowers only on my birthday and Valentine's Day. I still don't know who he is, but I know they're from him. When I was a child around 4 or 5 until I was about 15, I would hear knocking on my windows and someone calling my name. We lived in the country, and my aunt, who lived 2 houses down, but about a quarter of a mile away, had a boyfriend who lived with her and her children. He was always abusive to her and her sons, and he always seemed to want to babysit me or have me sit on his lap if I was around. He was a creep, to say the least. She left him when I was about 4 or 5, which is when the knocking started. My mother used to take me to work with her until I started kindergarten, and one morning he ran out in the road in front of us from the woods near our house. He pulled a gun and started screaming at my mother, but she knew he was dangerous, so my father had insisted she keep a pistol with her when she left the house, so she pulled hers and told him if he didn't leave, she would shoot him. He ran away and she sped off. A couple of weeks passed, and one night I heard it, the light tapping and knocking and someone softly calling my name from my bedroom window. My parents' bedroom was upstairs and mine was downstairs. My brother was staying next door at his friend's for the night, so nobody heard it but me. I was so scared I wet the bed. I screamed for my mother, but she told me it was a bad dream. This continued for a few years, hearing knocks about once a month, but we never saw the person who was doing it. One night, a couple of years after the first incident, my brother and I had stayed up watching a movie in the living room and had fallen asleep on the couches. We heard knocking and a voice calling my name from outside the window. He got up quickly and quietly and went to get my parents so that we wouldn't alert the person knocking. My father came downstairs with a gun and started screaming at the person and ran toward the outside to catch the creep. They got away, but the knocking didn't stop. When my brother got married and moved out, when I was in 5th grade, I would hear the knocking but would ignore it and would double check the window to make sure it was locked and the curtains were closed before bed every night. I just knew it was my aunt's creepy ex. I could hear the voice and it was him, but nobody believed me. In 7th grade it happened again, but he tried to break in through my window. I screamed and my mother called the cops when my dad went outside to try to catch him. He again got away, and the cops said they couldn't do anything since he never actually got in, and they couldn't prove it was him. My parents decided to move to a new house about 45 minutes away the next summer. But the week after the attempted break-in, we heard from my aunt that her ex had been in an accident and he was paralyzed and in the hospital. The knocks stopped after that. The years that the harassment went on were the most terrifying years of my life. I would always feel like I was being watched. And during the entire time, we would always get phone calls where all we heard was breathing before the person would hang up. When we moved, We also changed our phone number. My parents taught me how to shoot in case anything ever happened. My aunt's creepy ex died a year after we moved, and I know he was the one responsible for my years of terror and nightmares. I'm 21 now, and still cannot sleep without windows locked, curtains drawn, and a light on in the room to see everything. I can't stay anywhere by myself overnight without having nightmares. What about you? How do you think those events would have affected you? Many people assume they know exactly what they would do or say in a given situation. That is, until it is staring them in the face. It is not until that moment when they find out exactly how they will react or how it will affect them. If you have a story you would like to share here, please email me at DuchessDark676@gmail.com. See you next time.